All right. So, welcome to DAG's November monthly meeting on SEPTA's Rail Transit Wayfinding Master Plan. My name is Eli Storch. I'm the DAG chair. Really excited to have everyone with us this evening with the ability to be virtual. It's been fun to have these not always at the crack of dawn. So it is nice to get a different set of folks who may not always come out at 8 a.m. So before we get to any announcements, a few quick reminders and a couple of advocacy announcements. Please, if you're not presenting, keep yourself on mute. And if you have any technical difficulties, message Claire Adler or David Brownlee or myself, and we will do our best to help you out and go from there. Typically, our DAG meetings are off the record, but given the ability to record them and share them with a larger audience, we've chosen to do that. So that is a slight change from past meetings. So be aware of that. You have to click a little button that lets you know that we are indeed recording. And because of that, we have some of our wonderful past presentations on our website. So if you go to our events page, you can catch up on Whose History Is It? A panel discussion on the democratization of preservation. There's a really wonderful presentation by Shalimar Thomas from North Broad Renaissance, as well as an interesting program on historic home repair in Strawberry Mansion. So we usually begin with announcements. So if you have any announcements, events, anything that's going on that you'd like to share with the group, please put it in the chat and I will call on you. So keep those adding to the chat there. But in the meantime, first up, I am extremely excited to announce DAG's third annual fundraising appeal, which we call Dig Deep for DAG. Thank you for that lovely graphic, Claire. This is our third year running it, and we're going to be running from now until the end of the year. And if you go to our website and click on the support tab, there are multiple options to donate and help us reach our $10,000 goal. Your donation's tax deductible, and it helps our volunteer organization continue to provide this free public programming, the special events we get to do, as well as supports our various advocacy efforts in the city of Philadelphia and the region. And every year we ask a visionary in the field of Philadelphia design and development to support us and serve as the honorary chair, lending some of their track record and gravitas to our organization. And this year is no different. Past chairs, 2018 we had Stephen Kieran and James Timberlake. Last year Jerry Sweeney supported us, and this year it is a real pleasure to announce our honorary chair, John Gattuso from Gattuso Development Partners, along with his team. So yes, I have great respect for John and John's work over the years, but we do have Craig Shelter on our steering committee who has a close personal relationship with him. So I'd like to throw to Craig to give John a brief interview, and we are lucky to have John with us tonight, so he'll say a few words after that as well. So Craig, if you want to unmute yourself and take it away.
Thank you, Eli. And for those of you out there who may not know me, I've been on the DAG steering committee since its inception, and I think I was member number 8. So this has been a long association for me. And actually tonight, introducing John is probably the best pleasure I've ever had introducing someone in all those years. Because John reminded me today that, our relationship goes back for 37 years. When he started as an intern at summer intern at PIDC. And at that point, he came with abundant energy, abundant vision, and was for many people wanting to change the world in a way that was way too fast for most of us. But what he did was, I think what we ingrained in him was the idea of public-private partnerships. And when he left to go to Liberty Property Trust, he took the idea of the public-private partnership, and actually at one point showed me how to make it a really exciting design project to design a $1.5 million square foot warehouse in Northeast Philadelphia. And that was consistent throughout his whole career, not only with projects like that, but improving and developing and improving the two master plans at the Navy Yard with Robert Stern. And I think probably as important, making the Navy Yard a design lab for young architectural firms in the city and internationally known architects as well. And I think that brought some real excitement and some inspiration. And no one I know has ever taken as much time in terms of hiring the right architect to do the right kind of project. He's also, with his two, usually one magnum opus is enough, but John had two, both the Comcast Center, which they made their world headquarters in 2008, and then the Comcast Technology Center, where essentially was created there was a 1,121 foot tall, 1.8 million square foot Comcast Technology Center, which features a 5-star Four Seasons hotel, the tallest hotel in North America, I'm told, as well as incredible new waterfront projects in Camden, where the American Waterworks project is. I think it's significant that John, when Liberty decided that they were going to focus entirely on industrial construction rather than on the urban group, which John had so beautifully run all those years, he took several senior members of that urban development group and turned it into Gattuso Development Partners. And I think it's noteworthy that his title has partners in it, because he's always been very collaborative in terms of how he's worked. And the fact that now he's working on $125 million build-to-suit development at the Navy Yard, again, for Iovance Therapeutics, which broke ground in June of 2019. And in his spare time, when he hasn't been doing all these 50 projects, he is the president of the Fairmont Park Conservancy. He serves on the board as a board member of the Center City District. And as I said, he's a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis, and he lives in the greater Philadelphia region. So without further ado, I'll turn it over I always saw John as sort of my architect's son that I never had. And so John, take it away.
Eli, can you unmute John?
I don't think I can. I can ask to unmute.
John, you have to unmute yourself.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Oh,
There you are.
sorry guys. Just when you need the button, it disappears on you. So, and thank you, Craig, for that very gracious introduction, which of course I ceremoniously screwed up. But it is it's very exciting and humbling to be able to join the DAG in this major fundraising effort for the work that you do. And I think that I certainly have had over the years of being part of a lot of great change in the city of Philadelphia. And one of the things that we've always tried with our company, both at Liberty Property Trust and now with our new firm, has been to insist on and really strive for real excellence in everything that we try to do. And it is, we'd be remiss if we did acknowledge that we often don't quite achieve 100% of what we set out to do, but it is in that effort that's striving for quality, for great craftsmanship, for projects that hopefully not only are uplifting to the people that use them, but also give back to the people that are experiencing them in a very passive way. It's what we've hopefully made one of our trademarks. And that focus and that attention to detail and that recognition, frankly, that the built environment in Philadelphia and really throughout the region is so central to our sense of who we are, to our sense of place. Frankly, I think it actually underpins a great deal of our own self-esteem as individuals, that pride of place that without political commentary, but you clearly saw that this past weekend, the enthusiasm to be part of something larger than our individual selves. All of that can be shaped and reinforced and pushed, I think, in a very positive way through the quality of the built environment that we undertake and complete around us. I have had the great privilege to work and mentor, or to be a mentee actually, of some great mentors like Bill Rouse, and I include Craig in that. It does bum me out that Craig has not increased the amount of gray hair that he has since I first met him 37 years ago, but I clearly have more gray hair. But just really terrific opportunity to work with some great urbanists and people who care deeply about not just cities in general, but in particular the city of Philadelphia. I am also very fortunate to have two partners in Ann Cummins and Janice Wong, who are amazing in their own right. And when the three of us gather in the office, there's no question that I am certainly the dumbest one in the office. They are brilliant professionals who in many ways far exceed my abilities and have as much passion and have, in fact, even sometimes much more vision and certainly more energy than I in carrying out what can be some very complex projects over the past many years. I think going forward, this is a really interesting time that we exist in. And it's I think, a time that both has challenges for our city and incredible opportunity. By continuing to insist on excellence, by pushing out that sense of excellence in every aspect of the built environment, from both the buildings and the master planning and the public spaces that we create, we can go far in really having and helping Philadelphia to achieve its full potential. And that is not an elitist vision. I think that it's as important that the quality that one experiences in every one of the neighborhoods, even those that are under great pressure and struggle economically, it's in fact in many ways more important that the people can exist and in an invigorating environment, one that they can take pride in, and one which gives them hope and joy and a sense of true opportunity. Those aren't just words. I think they actually those are characteristics that can be created. I remember in our work with the Conservancy when we went up and spent, relatively speaking, relatively few dollars, about $4 million in Hunting Park after being actively discouraged from doing so by the then administration. To see the pride of the neighbors who came out, in some cases had not even spoken to each other in years, the pride that they took in the revitalized spaces, the public athletic fields and what have you that we were able to implement up in Hunting Park, you got a sense that that dignity that comes from that quality of environment meant so much. So this is something that is not benefiting one part of the city versus another. I think by focusing on quality, by doing the great work that you do as advocates and as conveners of discussions about the built environment and where it's heading and where it needs and possibly can move towards, you are laying the foundation for the success of our city in the years to come. We will get through the current challenges that we have. And I think that by keeping our eye on insisting on excellence in every aspect of what we do in design and planning, we will be able to achieve a city and create a city that is, as Bill Rouse used to say, really the greatest city in America. And that's a big mission, but it's one that's very accomplished, able to be accomplished. And the work that you do is central to that. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be your honorary chair this year.
Well, Thank you. It certainly is great to have you joining us and being part of this campaign. Our next e-blast is going to go out and we'll feature your letter to the DAG membership. And we will continue to drive forward to meet our fundraising goals for this year. And thank you and your team for being a part of it.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, John.
So in other exciting DAG news, we convened our DAG charrette this past Friday, which was a partnership between DAG and run by our Waterfronts Task Force, working alongside with Penn Praxis and our partners at the Weitzman School of Design. So I saw James Templeton on here. James, do you want to give us a little rundown of how that went and where things stand with that project?
Sure, absolutely. It was a very exciting day. We had been working toward this for about, oh, great. Thank you, Claire. For about 7 years, I had said, when George Claflin and I first presented to DAG a vision for the Schuylkill River and how we had recommended that there maybe be a master plan for the Schuylkill, or at least at the very least design guidelines, as the Schuylkill saw development popping up right and left while the Delaware was moving a little slower. And it's nice, we finally had it culminated in the charrette on Friday, which is very well attended. Leading up to the charrette was a series of focus groups that Penn Praxis had arranged with the students that for about a month, that included neighborhood participants, industry stakeholders, city officials, as well as planning and design professionals. And then from that, coupled with the existing condition analysis that the students who were working with Nanda Makali's Masters of City and Regional Planning class, they developed a booklet, and both the focus groups and this existing condition analysis really informed, set the table for the charrette. And the charrette was broken into 4 key groups: a housing group, a mixed-use residential retail group, a institutional growth group that I think first started focusing really on Pennovation, and then a parks and open space group. And we literally spent 6 hours, each group, developing concepts, talking about ideas. At the end, we shared some of those rough ideas, but then over the weekend, each of those groups broke out and spent more time fine-tuning some of the drawings and the sketches and the principles that they had developed. And all of it, I believe, neither Nando or Julie is on the call, I think, but all of it was delivered Monday at noon. So now the next step is that for the next few months, actually, the students and Penn Praxis are going to assemble and develop a book of design principles, images, precedent that really will, and everything that the charrette participants developed, that really will create a plan for advocacy for the Grace Ferry neighborhood, but also the idea that conceptually could be applied to any waterfront neighborhood along the Schuylkill River. So that's where we were, that's where we are. It was really a great success. There were about 8 people per group that consisted of, again, I think industry professionals ranging from sustainability expertise, water, PWD, landscape architects, developers, and zoning lawyers even. So we had I think a good representation of sort of everyone involved in development. So yeah, it went very well.
Thank you. I had an opportunity to sort of cherry pick my way through the day and jump group to group, and it was a fabulous conversation or set of conversations, and we're excited to see how that gets memorialized in the book as it gets developed. So thank you, and Nando and Julie for your leadership, and to Carrie Long and to George Claflin for taking part. as DAG steering committee members and specialists. So yeah, it was a really enjoyable day, and I'm excited to see next steps. So on from there, are there any announcements? I don't see any in the chat, but I'll give another minute. I'll talk a little bit about, we have our ongoing DAG Dispatch is our new post that we produce weekly. So Monday morning, it's a chance to check in on design and development news around the city, some interesting pieces on there. And also our forum has some new content. Nando Macaulay wrote a nice piece about the charrette that you can read if you want a little background there, as well as a really interesting piece that Faye Anderson put together about the historic Henry Minton House on 12th Street and its plight and ongoing conversations. So if you'd like to join us and write a forum piece, that's an opinion piece that is open to the public. So contact David Brownlee through the forum page on our website, or you can email dagfellow@gmail.com if you have an idea, if there's something you want to put into words. So we always look for those and really enjoy when we have the opportunity to share them on our forum. So I'm not seeing any announcements, so I think we'll move on. This is typically where I throw to my friend Marcia Moss to discuss upcoming events. We haven't been able to nail down the exact date for our next event, so if you keep your eyes out for our social media and our website, we'll be posting our upcoming December event soon, but there isn't anything to officially report just yet. So all of that said, and thank you for bearing with us, it's a real pleasure to get into our evening's program with Lex Powers talking about the SEPTA Rail Transit Wayfinding Master Plan. I've had a chance to get to know Lex briefly and take part in a stakeholder meeting that really speaks to the level to which SEPTA is reaching out to a really deep and broad group of Philadelphia constituents for this project. So I'm excited to have him share what he's working on, to hear more about it, and to fire some questions at him throughout the program. So you heard Lex laugh there, but he's ready to take those questions. So as he's presenting, please put some questions in the chat. We will have time at the end to go through them, and then without further ado, I will turn it over to Lex. Thank you for joining us and wearing a shirt that looks like mine.
Yeah, look at that. There's a lot of plaid button downs, actually. I think here. This is the first time I think I've worn a button down in 6 months. So special occasion. So yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Lex Powers. I'm a strategic planning manager at SEPTA in our Department of Strategic Planning and Analysis. And I am the PM on what we are calling our Rail Transit Wayfinding Master Plan. And that is an effort to completely redesign from scratch our wayfinding and branding system for our rail transit lines, which is the Market-Frankford Line, Broad Street Line, various trolleys, and the Norristown High Speed Line. So I don't know if I have control over the slides.
You can just tell me to go next.
Okay, next. So our draft goals as of now, they are to encourage the usage of SEPTA services as a flexible network. And that concept of network probably is one of the most important principles that we are working with here. We're trying to take things that have previously been seen as sort of disparate and make them into a cohesive whole. Two, it is to make our network easier to use and to understand for all. So that is for the people who have used our services for decades. It's for tourists, it's for students who are just moving here, for immigrants, for refugees, no matter what language you speak, no matter what your ability is, that you can easily enter the SEPTA system and find your way around. 3, to promote and advertise our services post-COVID-19. So this project predates the pandemic, but I think pretty much every project that we work on right now has ridership as one of those central goals as well. And then 4, to support future projects and improvements, which I'll get a little bit into later. Next slide, please. So this project has been a long time in the making. So, you know, we have a new general manager as of January, Leslie Richards, and it is her vision to emphasize SEPTA as a network, as we were just talking about, to focus on high quality customer experience and ease of use, relatively low cost improvements for a high impact, to utilize wayfinding and signage experts, and we do have an expert firm helping us with this project, and then of course to involve the public. As a true planner myself and as Leslie as a planner, we always add public outreach into any of these projects. So, you know, previously we've been told through many different channels that we needed to improve our signage. That's come from our own CAC, from the frequency project and CBNR that we've been working on with the new frequent bus map that came out last year. Our own internal departments have been raising red flags about the state of our signage, just on how they observe people having trouble navigating the network. You know, there was a Twitter account called SEPTA UX where they would post bad signs. That was about a year ago too. That's my favorite. I don't know who controls it, but I wish they would start up again. And then, of course, the way that we talk about and brand long-range projects, that all sort of filtered into creating this project. Next slide, please. So, who is this project for? So, wayfinding, the way I see it, the wayfinding and the branding, you know, has a bunch of different goals. But for the most part, we're looking at people who are new to the system, people who are new to the city, people of all abilities, immigrants, refugees, people with limited English proficiency, visitors, tourists, business travelers, and then of course the people who use SEPTA already but may not know exactly, you know, how to figure out another trip. They might use SEPTA for their commute every day from 9 to 5, but if you had to go to a doctor's appointment, if you had to go somewhere else, how easy is it to figure it out on the fly? You know, and for that reason, it must be inclusive. So we're trying to have as many of these meetings as possible, having workshops, public outreach, public services, public surveys, and then eventually in-person outreach when that is possible with the pandemic. Next slide, please. So for example, when we're talking about what exactly is the rail transit network and what is this project for, we can learn a little bit from the way that regional rail has a strong regional brand identity. You know, if you think about the term regional rail, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know the frequencies at which those trains likely come. You know that you need to check a schedule first, that the fares are higher, that the trips are long distance, so they have seats, and hopefully most of the time you can sit down. You know what a station looks like, you know what amenities are there, and you know that it's best in the way that it is scheduled and operated at the present moment for commuting into the urban core at typical peak periods, so like a 9 to 5 office job, for example. Next slide. If I put the other side of the coin of our rail network, this rail transit network, up on the screen, and I ask people, what is this? They usually either call it rail transit because that is the technical term that is on our map, and those people have really great knowledge of SEPTA. But for the most part, people don't exactly know what they're looking at. They don't know how to talk about it, what to call it, what sorts of characteristics it has. But all of these lines have things in common. They are high frequency most of the time. There are some exceptions, many of which are due to construction. You usually don't have to check a schedule when you use them. You just show up like a subway. They have lower fares, so a transit fare, and now there's that free transfer onto bus as well. The trips are likely shorter, which means you might be standing up. The way that the vehicles look is different. The station appearance or amenities, you know, are inconsistent throughout this this network, and that's something that, you know, we're going to try to improve on as we move forward with trying to define what this exactly is. And then, of course, it's convenient for all sorts of trips in many directions at any time of day. And if we think about all of these lines together, they make up what was about 40% of our pre-COVID-19 ridership, 400,000 trips per day, over 3 times the ridership of our regional rail network, and almost the ridership of our bus network. Right now, the ridership patterns that we're seeing on these lines is much healthier than what we're seeing on regional rail, because they're more likely to carry essential workers. They're more likely to carry people who don't have the luxury of working from home. So, you know, the city is really still depending on this network as we speak. Next slide, please. So the funniest thing when you start to look into this issue of branding, the more you poke around on SEPTA's website and SEPTA's different materials, the more you realize that a lot of these rail transit lines are sort of offered or presented as separate entities. So that this is a screenshot on the right from our website, where you can click regional rail, you can click Market-Frankford Line, Broad Street Line, Trolley lines, Norristown High Speed Line, and then also buses and CCT. They're each, you know, sort of referred to as their own separate product, despite, you know, transit lines for the most part being used in conjunction with each other as a flexible network, especially with that free transfer. That was a really big game changer. Next slide, please. So we're hoping to move to a brand hierarchy that looks something like this. And this is the crux of the problem. And I swear I will get into wayfinding very soon. About, you know, it's really difficult to make a cohesive system, a cohesive brand, a memorable and a useful wayfinding system, nomenclature, etc., if the lines are not referred to as a cohesive whole. So once you've got that brand, you can start to work out what is the name, what are the symbols and the logos that are standard, what are the graphic standards, what is the nomenclature, what is the wayfinding family that you have to have, when do you have station maps, when do you have network maps, when do you have neighborhood maps, and to make sure that those standards are consistent as much as possible across all of these different lines. And then, of course, there's the digital component of things, the website, the app, real-time arrival, all has to be coordinated. Next slide. One of the ways, you know, the easiest ways to talk about emphasizing network in signage, you know, we have all of these different maps on the left of these lines in isolation, and we're going to try to move towards something that shows them together. You know, and there's that note again about the free transfer, really making this sort of mindset possible. Next slide, please. We're also doing this intentionally because we're trying to prepare for the future. So, you know, I think it's pretty typical for people to think of the Broad Street and the Broad Street Line and the Market-Frankford Line together. Sometimes you think of the city trolleys since they've got that tunnel, you know, but for the most part, people don't necessarily think of the Norristown High Speed Line as a part of the same network as some of the trolley lines as the same network. But what we're facing over the next decade or so are these major projects, you know, that will transform the way that we're thinking about the Norristown High Speed Line, in that it connects to this major suburban employment center. And the way that we're talking about our trolley network, if you're going from something right now that runs a lot like a bus, where there's a stop on every corner, where the stops, you know, look like bus stops, to something where you have on-street stations, where you have level boarding, where you have, you know, a few blocks or a larger distance between stations, where it's running a lot more like a train. So how do we talk about this network as it's growing and as it's evolving? Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over a little bit of details on the audit. Next. So we've audited so far a smattering of stations around this network, and I'm going to go through what the recommendations have been so far at a high level, most of which are not going to be surprising for most of the people watching, I think, from our wayfinding experts. Next. Number one is, I think, the concept of branding, one of the things that we hear over and over, is that I don't know if the SEPTA website should be septa.org. I don't know if it's iSEPTA Philly. I don't know what Twitter account is the SEPTA Twitter account. And there are salient internal reasons why these things exist. But one of the strongest recommendations so far is to consolidate our public branding presence, and especially to combine our two websites into one. Next, please. So now I'm going to break this into first mile, departure, station, stop, boarding, en route, transfer connections, and last mile. So for the first mile, our recommendations so far, and I should mention that these are draft. They're not in the report yet. So I'm open and excited to hear your feedback on it when this presentation is over. But the first mile recommendations right now are to improve station stop identification signage and to improve the system map. 3, to develop strategy for information hierarchy and consistent nomenclature. Next slide. If you are approaching any one of the stations, in this network, you might not even know off the bat that they are all part of the same transit agency, let alone the same actual rail network. So, part of that is how can we take stations that by necessity, by design, look different, and through signage, through communication, through branding, make them look, like when you're entering a station on the Norristown High Speed Line, you understand that you can get to the L or eventually the Broad Street line from that station. This is the same thing ultimately. Next slide. Some of the best practices, around the world, obviously, you can't have a conversation about good wayfinding without talking about Transport for London. So, they obviously have an old system. They have stations that look all sorts of ways all throughout the London region, but when you walk up to an entrance, it is so obvious every time you see it. This is an entrance to the underground. I can see what the station name is. I can probably predict where I can find information about fares or maps or such. Next slide, please. And with that mapping point, that right now we like to show everything in isolation, which is probably an outgrowth of many of these lines originating as different companies, different operators being put into SEPTA after the fact. A lot of that separateness has just sort of been continued, and it's hard for new users to imagine how they can get the most out of the system. Next slide. Also very wordy. With the way that we write signs right now, not only is this just generally difficult for an English speaker to read if you're in a hurry, or if you're just don't want to read a long sentence or a paragraph of signage. It's really, really hard, if not impossible, for someone who doesn't speak English well, or for someone who doesn't speak English at all. And we are a city that, is more and more the destination for immigrants, that more and more has international travelers. And we want them obviously to use SEPTA, to think of SEPTA as the gateway, to the city and the region when they get here. Next slide, please. So for departure station stop, to develop sign location strategy for predictable availability of information, to implement customized rail transit signage system across all locations, enhance accessibility with standardized color coding and symbols, consolidate and simplify signage installation. Next slide. Terminology in the way that we use it right now is not always consistent. Even if it is the official terminology, it also relies again heavily on English, which is not the most accessible way that we can refer to our network. Next slide, please. So what we're going to be trying to do is to develop a transit language, if you will, that's a little bit more robust than the one that we have now, where we're using shapes and colors and numbers and letters and all of that sort of stuff. We haven't come up with the solution yet, but that's, you know, generally your palette of options, but without losing the uniqueness and, you know, all of the great cultural icons of Philadelphia and of our transit system. Next slide. So, you know, this is a good example from New York, and I think also from Toronto on their wayfinding signage systems. Next slide, please. Boarding to enhance visibility of night owl service and to provide real-time information where feasible. Next slide. This is something obviously that people talk to us a lot about, is the availability of real-time information. You know, and I will say it is not something that sits within planning at SEPTA, but we are working hard to incorporate it as a part of this project too. You know, I think that's maybe the most urgent thing that we are losing right now when it comes to the rail transit wayfinding system. So that's obviously a very central recommendation. Next slide. En route to implement digital information displays on board vehicles where feasible, to employ a consistent set of symbols, to provide clear instructions for specific transit modes. You know, not all of our train lines operate the same way. How do we kind of eliminate those complications in the view of the passenger? And to repeat the simplified route map where applicable. Next slide, please. You know, so some examples of pictograms that we use in our system right now. Next slide. And, you know, some examples of a pictogram alphabet in other agencies. So I think this is, I don't want to guess if it's Hong Kong, but I think it's Hong Kong. Next slide. You know, like I said a little bit ago, each one of our modes is a little bit different from the other, and we'd rather not get caught on the differences. We'd rather, you know, people think about the similarities. This is a picture from the Norristown High Speed Line, which is incredibly difficult for someone to use if they are not familiar with the specific geography of the suburbs directly west of the city. And I grew up in this area, and I've still messed this up a bunch of times, you know, with having to press a button when you get to the platform, and then also when you're on the vehicle. You know, I sit there with my phone and watch the GPS to make sure that I don't overshoot the station that I'm trying to reach. You know, so how can we simplify that and make information more available? Next slide, please. Transfer connections, provide information, basically, is the recommendation that we have for that. So go to the next slide. It's probably not surprising. A lot of our transfer hubs are where we're hearing people get lost. You know, through the survey, if you do a Control F through the results of the public survey that we have so far, I think City Hall, you know, is by far the most mentioned term that we have there so far. 30th, also 13th. So that's going to be a challenge. Next slide, please. And then last mile, to make egress signage more informative, to develop standards for when an outside entity is identified within the station, to develop location standards for bid provided neighborhood information within stations in consideration of rail transit sign locations as a priority. Next slide. So this is an example from Chicago. They have, I think, one of my favorite wayfinding and mapping programs in the United States. It's an example of some of the information displays that you will have when you are getting off of the L there. You'll have, you know, a map of the neighborhood, a map of bus connections or local transit connections, and then a map of the full system. So you always know that you can go to a certain place in the station to find this information. You know that it's going to be there, and there's a lot of comfort in that. Next, please. So outreach, like I said, one of the elements that makes this project a little bit different from projects in the past, despite its comprehensive nature, is the way that we're trying to incorporate outreach into a bunch of different steps of this process. So next slide, please. I'm going to run through a little bit of the outreach that has been done so far, and then also the outreach that we have on the table right now, but then also in the next 6 to 9 months. So we have completed our internal workshops, which we were happy. Wait, sorry, internal workshops are SEPTA employees. That was great. That was done in September. We completed our external workshops, which we were happy to include Eli in, a few months ago, along with a bunch of other different agencies and organizations. We're doing a bunch of presentations like this. We have a public survey up right now on iseptaphilly.com/wayfinding. The information right under it should be updated. I think we have about 1,400 or 1,500 responses as of now, and it's closing on 10/13. We did not close it on the 6th because we were still getting a steady stream of responses there per day. And we have that in English, and we have that in Spanish and in Chinese. And then also through social media, we've been doing something that we call TransitMapTuesday. And then Carrie Long and Megan Ryerson from the Penn Center for Safe Mobility are going to be helping us, COVID permitting, with their eye tracking technology, trying to actually take people into the system, seeing where they get tripped up, seeing where they look for information, but they don't find information, where they're feeling stressed. And I'm going to let her speak about that in a little bit towards the end of the presentation. And then finally, the prototype stations. Once we've gone through this existing conditions process, once we've gone through the initial outreach and we've developed concepts, that we will move then to install concepts in stations and try to get feedback from our riders in person and see how that goes. Next slide, please. So like a little bit about TransitMapTuesday is something that we've been doing on social media with our department's intern program. And what our extremely talented intern has been doing is redesigning the SEPTA system map in the transit languages, using the languages of other transit agencies and seeing how perceptions change. For example, I think that's the Boston on the left, which includes the bus network. I think that's a comment that we've received a lot, is any map in the future should include the frequent bus network. Los Angeles in the middle, and then some design languages from Germany on the right. Next slide, please. And then here are, just a preview of the sorts of organizations that we've been working with for the external workshops, but also, for our presentations, for our external conversations that we've been having. A lot of groups that represent the tourism industry, that represent people with disabilities, that with immigrants and refugees, people who speak Spanish, different community organizations across the city. And really what we're hearing is that any signage system, any brand needs to be useful for those most vulnerable people, but at the same time, it needs to be a brand that speaks to Philadelphians, that feels authentic, that doesn't feel contrived or imposed in any way. And that, I think, is going to be the biggest balance. So next slide, please. Here's just a screenshot of those sorts of activities that we had as a part of those workshops. Next slide. This was my favorite activity. We had people from memory from one of the activities draw the SEPTA system as they remember it and see it in their brain without looking at any sort of map or cheat, and then try to label it. Some people were really good at it. Some people got really detailed. But the point is sort of that you only give people a few minutes, you catch them off guard, you see what they put first, you see what they label things, what terms they're using, what is missing, what is not missing. And you start to get a really great picture of how people perceive this network. We also did this exercise with the GM team and with the SEPTA board also. So it really sort of developed a life of its own. Next slide, please. Some findings from that. Obviously, the Broad Street and the Market-Frankford Line are seen as central pieces of this network. People really don't leave them out. They really don't forget them. They have the highest ridership, but awareness of the Norristown High Speed Line, of the city trolleys, of the media share and hill lines, especially in Delaware County, really start to decrease. Next slide. And then, of course, when people are labeling things, what do they put down? Almost 60% said that, or used an abbreviation of a full line name. 16% about used colors. 12% or 13% used an abbreviation plus colors, and then only 11% wrote out the full names. Next slide. The most frequently included stations were City Hall / 15th Street. People often referred to both of those stations together. 69th Street Transportation Center, and then also NRG, which was referred to most frequently as stadiums or sports complex or something along those lines. Next slide, please. When we're talking about brand and what sort of brand people think SEPTA has and should develop or cultivate in the future, I think it's probably no surprise people think that on these various continuums that you see in front of you, we tend to communicate in a way that's detailed, that is serious, that is relatively low tech, that is relatively corporate, and that is relatively technical. It's almost as if the SEPTA speaks to itself sometimes when we are communicating to our riders and our customers, and that ultimately we should be moving towards something that is simple, that is playful, high tech, personable, and more colloquial, but also striking, that balance between being friendly, but being serious and reliable, et cetera. Next slide, please. SEPTA Connections was an activity to allow people to mark the sorts of places that they're trying to access on the SEPTA system. Next slide. So, what sorts of places do we need to refer to better within our system? And it tends to be hospitals, it tends to be universities. The historic district around the Liberty Bell is obviously very important for travelers. We also got, the fashion district. The Met is on here, was the only performing arts venue that made it onto here up at Broad and Girard. So I think, they just opened like a year ago. So great marketing for them because they made it. Art museum, airport, zoo, all of these places that are worth calling out, within our wayfinding system to help people find their way. Next slide, please. And then we're going to get a little bit into the conversation that we had about system nomenclature. So, you can't really have a conversation about wayfinding without having a conversation about nomenclature. Next slide. And the findings that we found from those conversations are, to avoid geographically derived names, for example, city, urban, suburban, a lot of, these things cross those boundaries. And we found that people, either really like or really don't like names or that are literal. That there needs to be a balance of the needs of locals and visitors, longtime residents, recent arrivals, and people, who are LEP or have illiteracy. And then, of course, then again, authentic and Philadelphian, and avoid an overlap with other systems like the Metro in DC. Next, please. So, we were trying to brainstorm within these groups, what sorts of words would you use for this network? And these were the ones that came up the most often. I just want to preface it by saying it's not a proposal. I'm just sort of giving you an overview of those sorts of conversations and what things people liked and what things people didn't like. So, City Rail was something that came up a lot. Rapid Rail was something that came up a lot since we're thinking about frequency. Transit implies quick and fast. Quick and fast is something that applies to Market-Frankford Line and Broad Street Line, but would people use that term for the trolleys if they're stuck in traffic, for example? You know, and then also, you know, a light rail vehicle or an in-street vehicle without its own right-of-way are not technically considered rapid. And then a lot of these are also in the suburbs. 3 of the lines are in the suburbs. Next, please. We threw out a concept, you know, like the T in Boston. What if you called it the S in Philadelphia? And 100% of people hated that. You know, which I was not surprising. You know, we certainly learned, like was mentioned earlier, that Philadelphians don't like things that appear or feel imposed or synthetic, and that, you know, does by, you know, fairly feel imposed and synthetic. Local rail, you know, was something that came up, and then also sub-L had mostly negative reactions, but was very polarizing. Is actually the name of the group internally at SEPTA that operates the Market-Frankford Line and the Broad Street Line, which is short for subway elevated. Next slide, please. Then we broke it into names. You know, if you could rename these lines, what are the different nomenclature systems that are available to us? And it doesn't mean that we will. It doesn't mean that any of these are the options that we have to choose from, but they're generally the most prevalent nomenclature systems available to transit agencies when you're talking about a subway or a metro network, something like that. You know, so what we have now are those formal names that Market-Frankford Line, Broad Street Line, Norristown High Speed Line, Trolleys. That is the 4th down. We also talked about, you know, color, number, letter, and then a combination. So we'll move forward and talk a little bit about the way. Next slide, please. So with the existing nomenclature, some of the pros, people felt like they like the current names because they give a lot of geographic information. You know, the Broad Street Line is under Broad Street, Market-Frankford Line is on Market Street and Frankfurt Avenue, among others. You know, it makes sense to be able to tell people where to find those lines. And then, of course, you know, since they're sort of embedded at this moment, Philadelphians are not going to take something, are not going to stop saying something because we've told them to stop saying something. You know, cons are that the names can actually conflict with the route sometimes, that the names do not accurately describe the coverage or the sorts of service that we're offering. You know, and that sometimes there's an overlap between what we're calling a destination and what we're calling a line, for example. Next. Blue, orange, purple, green, using colors. I think everyone pretty much agreed, everyone was on the same page that the actual use of a color is really important. You know, so I don't think there's any future in which we are not using color, but the proposal of using actual colors for line names, you know, people thought that those would be useful for newcomers, for visitors, for immigrants, you know, that it's great for wayfinding. You can come up with a lot of options when you're using color, although you don't necessarily need to name something a color. You know, but people also said it's been tried before. Obviously, we all know, you know, what happened in the 80s. And that also you need to add more information to make it kind of work. Next slide, please. Numbers, I think, were also felt to be accessible to, you know, certain populations, non-English speakers, especially, you know, people who speak languages that don't use the Latin alphabet, especially. But there was also a feeling that historically in Philadelphia, numbers have been used for our bus routes. You know, so it didn't feel like something that was naturally applicable to SEPTA. Next, please. And then, you know, with letters, you know, I think that people sort of like that this felt like an outgrowth of the current system. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, L is up there for the Market-Frankford Line, but it could also be M or anything else. I mean, we're not proposing anything right now. And then the cons is, you know, there could be a lot of pushback. There could be a lot of criticism, obviously, because this looks a lot like the nomenclature system that we had for regional rail up until about a decade ago. Next, please. So key findings is that balance between creating a system that is accessible for newcomers, people of all abilities, and that it also speaks to Philadelphians and that feels culturally salient, you know, and true to who we are as a city. That abbreviations based on historic names provides authenticity and has natural momentum. Color coding increases overall usability and meets diverse user needs. To consider how to more accurately and clearly connect lines to geographic regions served and provide orientation and cues to surrounding environment through the naming scheme. Next, please. Key findings also out of these workshops, you know, people definitely think of the Market-Frankford Line and the Broad Street Line as the backbone of the system. So part of the challenge is going to be how do you bring in all of these other lines into that same network and promote it as a comprehensive whole. The Media Sharon Hill line is probably going to be the hardest based on you know, its brand awareness throughout the city and throughout the region. It's typically the lowest. And then, of course, the system is defined by connections to educational institutions, Philadelphian history, and athletic pride. Next, please. Key findings from the brand experience, that the entire communication strategy must primarily consider the user's understanding of our system. That goes back to, you know, sometimes when SEPTA communicates, we think that the audience is ourselves. We don't necessarily communicate with a customer or a rider, to use some natural intuition in the way that we design our system and the way that we're communicating, and then also use the same voice throughout our various media. So you know what the voice of SEPTA sounds like. For example, there are a lot of transit agencies that have a lot of guidance around what the voice of sound transit is in Seattle, especially on the West Coast. They're big about that. Next slide, please. That balance between the accessibility with newcomers and visitors and the local uniqueness and charm of Philadelphia, and then also making sure that our brand presence is approachable and inviting. Next slide, please. And now I think Carrie is on the line. I'm going to let her speak to this slide and this next outreach activity phase that we will be going into likely within the next few months.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lex. And real quick, just thank you again for joining us today and introducing this project. I'm thrilled with all the questions and comments coming in, and I'm very excited both to be involved in this project, but also just to see the agency and the city taking on this really important initiative and investment in improving the public realm. I think it's a very interesting design project, so I am thrilled to be with this group here tonight. So my name is Carrie Long, and my team through the Center for Safe Mobility at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design is going to complement all of the work Lex just outlined by conducting an eye tracking analysis of the experience navigating through the station, finding your service, and accessing the vehicle. This lets us understand how riders interact with these different elements along the way, whether it's signage or maps, or even knowing what route you're going to get to your destination. And from that, we can pull out variables related to, how you process the information given to you. Where are the pain points? Where do riders get confused? Where should signage go if it's not there already? And where is there perhaps too much signage? What causes confusion and stress? So the images at right are actually from other similar projects based in New York City. You might recognize, some of the signage from earlier slides. And as Lex mentioned, our research and this entire project really wants to make sure it is inclusive in scope and making sure we're capturing the experience of SEPTA's ridership base. So, we're really focused on targeted outreach to make sure we capture the experience of riders, not just the daily riders, but the visitors, and not just, business folks and people who, use the system regularly, but getting a diverse sample of individuals, especially those who have mobility or sensory or cognitive differences, and a heavy emphasis on folks for whom English is not their first language. I think for a system to be intuitive, it needs to be not read, but just sensed and easy to use. And I've seen in the chat a lot of great points that I'm very excited to speak to, and I'm happy to follow up afterwards, talking about reaching other SES classes, making sure we have a diverse sample of socioeconomic groups and such. I am really excited to be working with a network of community direct service providers, both in diverse geographic communities, so throughout the city, but also a diversity of advocates and groups that work with different identity or issue-based populations, so historically marginalized groups or folks who identify as one of these key target populations. So again, I will put my email in the chat. We will be starting to recruit folks for this very cool research study in the coming weeks, and I encourage you all to attend. It is fun, but it's also really, really helpful to us to get a sense of the rider experience. So thank you again, Lex, for all of the great work you're doing, and thank you everyone here tonight for your ideas and feedback in the chat. I won't ramble on too much longer about research, but please feel free to email me if you have any questions.
Thank you, Carrie. And then we just have one slide left, which has 4 short bullets. Oh wait, we have 2 slides left, sorry. So, through the spring, after we've developed some concepts based on the recommendations that we are developing right now, we hope to install those in various stations on the Broad Street Line and the Market-Frankford Line at first. These are just sort of draft locations right now, and I think that we're open to working with the different neighborhood groups in these areas to make sure that when we're designing a neighborhood map, that it's got the right stuff on it, that they feel involved. We're coordinating with the city's Broad Germantown Erie project to make sure that the improvements that are happening to that station are in step with the streetscape improvements that the city is leading on the surface as well. So a lot more outreach to come in 2021, and hopefully not on Zoom anymore eventually. Next slide, please. So quick overview of next steps. We've got the Penn research project that Carrie's helping us with. We are going to wrap up the existing conditions phase and then move into concept development, which is when I'll have hopefully some pretty things to show you guys. And then ultimately the prototype stations as a new round of outreach in 2021. So with that, I see that the chat is kind of going crazy. I've had a chance to read a little bit of it. I love the recommendations. If you have any recommendations, now is the time to write them. But I'll open it up to Eli for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that background and for setting us up with the data you've been collecting and where you're going from here. I want to let everyone know this chat will go to Lex. He will get the whole thing as a document. So if I don't mention your comment or question, please don't think it is lost. It is lost to history. We will be sharing all of these. One question I wanted to start with was in terms of who is doing this design work. You mentioned that you were working with the design team. Can you talk about who they are and what their role is?
Yeah, they are called Entro Communications. I think it's just entro.com if you want to look them up. They're a Canadian experiential design and wayfinding firm, but we're working with their New York office. And they are really helping us lead this study. This is something that they've done previously with other transit agencies who are trying to develop not just the actual signage, but the brand from the ground up. So they are helping us a lot with the outreach, with the research, with the auditing, with pulling together all of the information about how crazy our existing conditions are, and then helping us to construct the signage manual that will dictate, what the system looks like. And we haven't quite gotten into the details of implementation yet. It's difficult to do that before you actually know what sort of system you are working with. So, right now they're going to help us nail down the details with this research of what that new system will entail and what it will look like.
So just to push a number of questions into one larger question, and we can break it up as needed. You're working on a new system, yet there are things like regional rail that are left out. There are things like buses that are left out. Why just this and not the full system as one system?
So that's a good question, and we always get it. The reason why buses are not included, and buses ultimately are going to have to feel like an extension of this network, especially with the free transfer, is because we are headed into a bus network redesign over the next few years, where we can't predict what our bus network is going to look like a few years from now. And that's going to be a huge project with a lot of public outreach, where renaming, renumbering, redesigning the bus network, everything is on the table there. So it's really difficult to design a wayfinding network for a bus network that does not exist yet. But rest assured that we are thinking ahead of how that system will fit into the one that we're developing. For regional rail, I think that there are a lot of really exciting conversations going on right now about what the future of regional rail is, what the future of regional rail service is. And we think that, our vision, not just SEPTA's vision for regional rail, but the region's vision for regional rail needs to be worked out before we redesign and bring that into the fold in the same way. So, we're really excited to see those conversations progress about the future of regional rail.
A few folks sort of backing all the way out and looking at, the name of the agency itself, SEPTA, as antiseptic, bland, and bureaucratic, and doing something that was more relevant to Philadelphia as being a symbol of a really, of a new look, a new approach. Comment on that, thoughts on that, about the agency itself, how it's named and how that affects, conventions below it? It's kind of a big question.
Not sure. It's a big question. I'm not sure that the term that the acronym SEPTA will change. And off the record, I'm also not the biggest fan of the way SEPTA sounds. But I do think that there is appetite internally, especially right now with what is going on nationally with transit and with transit ridership, to think about our brand and how we are perceived and how we can introduce ourselves in a new way post-pandemic. That is going to help win back the massive amounts of ridership that we've lost over the past few months. So I think that is certainly, I think that a higher level corporate rebranding is something that we're looking at.
Are you looking into developing any systems to help newcomers get to where they want to go in a new location? Maybe helpful, particularly for those who don't speak any of the translated languages. I think you've covered that one a bit. I'm just trying to make sure I cover all these questions.
Yeah. When you have a transit language, when you have, a set of symbols, numbers, colors, shapes that you're using in your signage in a consistent way, it reduces the amount of times that you need to actually translate something directly into a different language. So, you obviously sometimes need to provide a direct translation, but hopefully the system that we will have at the other end is helpful for people who speak many different types of native languages.
So David Brownlee pointed out that the Center City District placed great historical placards on the Center City bus stops, linking the vital present to the interesting past to create a great sense of unity across the system. Is there a method, could that be expanded to include subway, rail, trolley lines?
I think we would love to look into partnerships with outside agencies, especially when it comes to art, when it comes to making sure that our different stations are distinctive and have that interesting touch to them. So it's not something that we have specific plans for yet, but I think it's a good idea.
Just a point of clarification. At one point, you mentioned that the survey was staying up until 10:13. I think you meant 11:13. Is that correct?
11:13, yes.
Okay, cool. No, just wanted to make that clarification. So there was one comment, as you were talking about the overlaid maps, and then you showed Chicago that breaks them out. If you could go into a little more, you spoke about how much you like that, about the idea of multiple maps at each site in order to give context but also clarity.
Yeah, if you go into a SEPTA station now, it's number one, not easy for you to predict necessarily where those maps are going to be installed. Like there are some exceptions, for the stations that were all built at the same time. Like if you think about stations on the L in West Philly or certain Broad Street Line stations where there's some consistency. But number one is figuring out, how can we put them, for example, like right near the entrance where you've got like 1, 2, 3 right there all the time. And then what are the different levels of information that you need? So there are some stations on the Broad Street Line, for example, that only have a SEPTA full system map, which provides both too much information and too little information, for the types of trips that people are trying to make on the Broad Street Line. The famous example, of I think why people like to talk about improving that map, the trolleys disappear when they go above ground. The trolleys almost have as much ridership as our entire regional rail network, but they disappear as arrows when they go on street. So what sorts of information do we need on a transit network map? That will likely, what we're thinking now, will replace those line diagrams, those lines and isolation maps. That can be 4 feet by 4 feet, but not give you a whole lot of information. And then the other type of map that we're looking at is a neighborhood map. So you have, where it shows you different institutions in the neighborhood, where points of interest are, where you can transfer to buses and other services.
So a question about the connection between wayfinding and architectural design. You look at George Claflin's bringing up that there is, the Broad Street Line has a very different series of designs, whereas something like Washington has the luxury of being built from scratch. As you make these decisions, does that inform future architectural decisions, future design decisions that go beyond, the current study in terms of this package?
Yeah, and I mean that's certainly a step two. I think step one is figuring out what this network is, what it's called, and what it looks like. And then step two is trying to figure out what those standard characteristics are. So I mean the Broad Street Line is gorgeous. So we're never going to try to erase, I don't think, the unique characteristics of the Broad Street Line. But as you go into station renovations, when you're upgrading something to ADA, what are the elements that you want to include in a Broad Street Line station that you also want to include in an L station? That also speaks to the way that we're designing on-street trolley mod stations, modern trolley stations. They don't have to be the same. They shouldn't be the same. They're different lines. But when you're talking about what materials do we use, the shapes, the designs, I think we're going to be looking in the longer term into how we can develop something that can be universally applied. The same sort of thing goes for services too. We're saying that these things are frequent, but there are huge gaps, in frequency on some of these lines in the middle of the day, for example, and how can we address that?
So this is obviously a passionate Philadelphia contingent we have here, who have a connection to these various systems. And I think there's some little agita about the idea that this thing shifts too far towards, numbers and letters and loses its
Mhm.
connections to the locals who use it and the city that it is. So, in your personal opinion, as you've gone through these, could you, just give a little insight onto how you think we keep some of that important history as well as modernizing it and making it more accessible?
Well, like for example, if I had to guess on the sort of system that's going to come out the other side, we'll likely keep the names, in some way, but also trying to figure out how we can abbreviate them in a way that is accessible. So we don't get rid of the term Broad Street Subway or Broad Street Line or Market-Frankford Line, where, people who have lived here for a long time, who know those names, who have a connection to those names, and who care a lot about Philadelphia's cultural identity. I think, honestly, like someone mentioned earlier, after the past week, I've never been prouder to be a weird Philadelphian. So how can we leverage that? How can we project our identity with something like this in the same way that London does with their wayfinding system that's become, honestly, an international symbol of the city? You don't do that, by getting rid of the things that people find important. So I can't predict the future, but I can assure you that is maybe the number one thing that I'm worried about.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of questions here. There are a lot of comments, and again, I'll be making sure to forward those so those all get recorded as part of your data collection, and you can see the different comments that our folks have. Carrie put her email on up in the chat, and I'm going to put this down towards the bottom now, so anyone looking at it catches it. Can you put your contact information here at the bottom if anyone wants to reach out as well?
Yep.
There it is. And I also put the iseptaphilly.com/wayfinding on there. If anyone wants to go on there and take the survey, again, more individually formalize your thoughts. That's a really good place to go and put that in there. George is throwing one last question out here. Ari, the bus system, the quote unquote transportation centers will not change. So could they be incorporated? Some of them are intermodal, others are only bus transfer terminals, gradually becoming more European, which is, in George's opinion, is a good thing.
Through this project, we will be touching the transportation centers that serve the rail transit network, FTC, 69th Street, and then the signage that deals with that network will be redesigned. But for example, the bus stop signage on the curb is going to wait until the bus network redesign. So it'll be an iterative process, but I do promise that throughout the other side, it will be a large improvement.
Well, Lex, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate you taking the time. You see the applause is coming through. I share in that. I appreciate your hard work and effort, and you can see the passion from our group here.
I expect nothing less. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, and we will have you back in spring, summer when we're in the first phase of the rollout mode, just to give us an update on where a lot of this landed, and then as we go through the future phases, connecting everything into one coherent system, we will bring you back and bug you some more.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Keep your eyes open for our social media posts and our e-blast. We'll be sending out information about our December meeting. And if you have a few bucks to send over to DAG, head to our website, click the support button, and to join in on our fundraising campaign. And with that, I thank you, and we will all be together some point in December for our next meeting. Thanks, everyone. All right, I am stopping the recording.
That was really interesting. That was great.
Indeed.